Hello everyone today. We're going to explore a case that occurred in the state of Pennsylvania, USA. An anonymous phone call, a mysterious woman's body, sparked a manhunt that lasted over a decade. This is the largest and most expensive investigation in the state's history. Not only has it been documented in books, but it was also adapted into a television series. So, you can imagine just how intense it got. On the early morning of Monday, June 25th, 1979, the Harrisburg police station in Pennsylvania received an anonymous call from a man. He told the dispatcher that he had discovered a sick woman lying in the trunk of a Plymouth car parked in the lot of a hotel in the town of Swatara. The police arrived at the parking lot at 5:38 p.m. that same day. However, what they found was not a sick woman, but a lifeless, naked body of a woman with multiple wounds on her body. In the following hours, the police focused on identifying the victim. Once her identity was confirmed, the police were immediately unsettled. It wasn't because the victim had some unusual background, but rather because the information they gathered revealed that before being murdered, the victim had been with her 2 children. Yet, there were no signs of the children at the scene. At that point, the police realized they were dealing with a highly complex case. What they didn't expect was that this case would turn into a relentless battle that would stretch over many years. The victim's name was Susan Reinert, born in the small town of Ridgeway in northwestern Pennsylvania. Susan's mother was a teacher, and from a young age, she dreamed of following in her mother's footsteps. So, when she went to college, she chose to major in English. It was during her time there that she met Kenneth Reinert, who would later become her husband. They married in 1965, right after Susan graduated from college, and she began her master's in English at Pennsylvania State University. She eventually completed her degree in 1966. The couple then moved around various places in the United States for a few years. In 1971, they decided to settle down in Philadelphia. During these years, Susan and Kenneth had 2 children, a daughter named Karen Reinert and a son named Michael Reinert. Unfortunately, their happiness didn't last. Susan and Kenneth separated in 1974 because they felt they were no longer compatible. They finally divorced in 1976. However, it was an amicable split, without any conflict, and they maintained a good friendship. After the divorce, Susan took the 2 children to live in the suburb of Ardmore, Philadelphia. Every 2 weeks, she would take them to stay with Kenneth for 2 days. The next thing the police needed to determine was what Susan had been doing before she was murdered. Through investigation, they found that the last time Susan was seen was on June 22nd, 1979. Early that morning, Susan had dropped her 2 children off at Kenneth's house. By 8:30 p.m. that evening, she returned to pick them up. The reason for this was that Susan had to attend a meeting in Allentown the following Saturday morning. And while there, she planned to register her children for a kids' activity. At 9:00 p.m. that night, Susan's neighbors saw the 2 children playing outside the house. About half an hour later, Susan drove off in her orange Plymouth with the children. Then, on June 25th, the police received the call about the body, and Susan's body was found in a hotel parking lot. The investigation. According to the preliminary autopsy report from the coroner, Susan's cause of death was likely suffocation. Her time of death was estimated to be around 12:15 p.m. on June 24th, a Sunday. Although they found several items in Susan's car, such as an umbrella, a Coca-Cola bottle, a blanket, and a massage tool, most of these items were unrelated to the case. The only thing that caught the police's attention was a green comb with the words Army Reserve Command 79 at Norristown, Pennsylvania printed on it. According to the staff at the hotel where Susan's body was found, her car had not been seen in their parking lot on June 24th. It only appeared a few hours before the police arrived. However, they were unsure how the car got there. This meant that, based on the coroner's estimated time of death, the parking lot wasn't the original crime scene. Susan's body had been moved there from another location. By this point, the investigation had yet to turn up any useful leads, but it raised several important questions. Where had Susan gone after 9:30 p.m.? On Friday, she had planned to go to Allentown, so why had she ended up in Harrisburg, a place in the opposite direction? Who had moved Susan's body to the hotel faced with these mysteries? The police were completely lost. Therefore, they decided to start by investigating Susan's family and friends in hopes of finding a helpful lead. However, this line of inquiry not only failed to provide any useful information, but it also left the police even more confused. According to her friends, Susan was a very cautious person. She didn't easily socialize with strangers and always kept her distance from them. Furthermore, she spent most of her time and energy raising her 2 children, rarely going to bars or nightclubs. So, her friends all agreed that whoever had harmed her had to be someone she knew. In addition, they provided another piece of information: Susan had a very close boyfriend. They had been in a relationship for several years and were planning to get married. His name was William Bradfield, a colleague of Susan's. In 1971, after settling in Philadelphia with her ex-husband, Susan began teaching English at a high school called Upper Merion. William was also an English teacher. As the police delved deeper into William's background, they discovered that he and Susan had been involved since 1974. Do you remember when Susan separated from her ex-husband? Coincidentally, it was also in 1974. However, their relationship had always been kept secret. Their dates were discreet, and at first, even their colleagues were unaware of it. According to William, the secrecy was because he was a private person who didn't like others knowing too much about his personal life. But the truth was that William was a bit of a ladies' man. Susan was just one of many girlfriends he had. Perhaps until her death, Susan still believed she was William's one and only lover. So, was William the killer? Unfortunately, no. He had an airtight alibi. 2 other teachers from Chamery School, Vincent Valadis and Susan Myers, confirmed that on the morning of June 23rd, a Saturday, the 3 of them had gone to Cape May, New Jersey, and didn't return to Philadelphia until the afternoon of June 25th. This cleared William from the list of suspects. At this point, the police wondered if perhaps Susan's ex-husband, still holding a grudge over their past, had taken revenge. With this suspicion, they began investigating Kenneth Reinert, but Kenneth was quickly cleared as well. The reason was simple. First, he had a solid alibi at the time of the crime. Second, he had no motive. Kenneth was an executive at a company with a high income. His relationship with his 2 children and Susan was still good. Most importantly, he had remarried a few years earlier, and his new wife had just given birth to a baby boy 6 months prior. With this, the investigation hit a dead end. The break in the case. About a month after Susan's murder, on July 20th, 1979, a lawyer in Philadelphia unexpectedly sent a statement to the authorities in Susan's hometown, representing her ex-husband and brother. The statement requested a delay in executing her will. Although Susan was just a teacher, her estate was worth a staggering $1 million. Keep in mind that this was the 1970s, and that amount would be worth tens of millions today. How did she accumulate so much wealth? The reason was that Susan had taken out 2 life insurance policies with different companies, one worth $500, $1,000, and another worth $160,000. Additionally, in 1978, Susan's mother passed away and left her a large inheritance, which included $200, $1,000 in assets, and $30,000 in cash. Along with her own savings, Susan's total estate amounted to $1 million. However, this was not the most significant detail. What stood out was that, initially, Susan's children were the beneficiaries of her estate and life insurance policies. But just a few weeks before Susan's death, she changed her beneficiaries to her boyfriend, William Bradfield. What's even stranger is that, a few weeks before Susan was murdered, $25, $100,000 of this amount was withdrawn, but Susan didn't buy anything of notable value. This raised suspicions within her family, who immediately contacted the bank to inquire about the withdrawal. Surprisingly, the bank staff still remembered the transaction because the amount was so large and withdrawn all at once. It exceeded the daily withdrawal limit. When they spoke with the bank staff, Susan explained that she wanted to invest the money into high-return projects being managed by her boyfriend. In other words, Susan's ex-husband and brother believed that this money was now in William's possession. To the police, this gave William a motive for murdering Susan, and the more they investigated, the more they uncovered. The police found many stocks and bonds at Susan's home, but the problem was, all of these were fake. In other words, William had received $25,000 from Susan and then created a series of fake stocks and bonds to give to her. His actions were considered a serious case of fraud. Because of this, in 1980, William was brought to court. However, the issue of his alibi still couldn't be explained. So, the police speculated that William might have had an accomplice. The second suspect. Following this lead, the police resumed their investigation. And it was thanks to this investigation that a second suspect emerged. His name was Jay Smith. This name might sound unfamiliar to you, but to William and Susan, he was not only an acquaintance, but also their superior. He was the former principal of Chamery High School. There were 4 main reasons why Smith was considered a suspect first. Jay Smith was a very introverted person who rarely interacted with others. Yet, during his time as principal, he had a fairly close relationship with William. However, what was odd was that these two seemed very reluctant to let others know they were friends. Whenever someone who knew them saw the two of them together, they would explain that it was just a coincidence. Second, on August 19th, 1978, Principal Smith was arrested in a shopping mall parking lot. The reason was hard to believe. He was wearing a hat, carrying 2 handguns, and attempting to break into a car. After his arrest, the police found 2 more fully loaded handguns in his vehicle, a silencer, and a large quantity of illegal drugs. The police immediately applied for a search warrant. To their surprise, what they found at Smith's house was even more shocking. In addition to more weapons and contraband, they found a security guard uniform. Astonishingly, this uniform resembled the one worn by the suspect in a series of unsolved armed robberies from 1977. Because of these findings, Smith was taken to court and eventually convicted. However, he didn't accept the verdict and requested an appeal. Then, on June 25th, 1979, Smith unexpectedly surrendered to the Harrisburg authorities, withdrew his appeal, and confessed to all his previous crimes. From that point, he began serving his prison sentence. Sharp-eyed listeners may have noticed something strange. Yes, the same day Susan's body was discovered was June 25th, and the location was near Harrisburg. Could this be just a coincidence? Third, do you remember the comb with the Army Reserve Command 79 logo found in Susan's car before becoming a principal? Jay Smith was a colonel in the Army Reserve Command 79. Next, the preliminary autopsy results indicated that Susan died from asphyxiation. However, after the results of the blood and tissue tests came in, this cause of death was ruled out. The coroner found that Susan had a dose of anesthetic in her system that was 10 times lethal. And it turned out that Smith was storing large quantities of such drugs at his home. With these 4 points, many of you might think that Smith is definitely the killer. It's very likely that William had asked Smith to kill Susan while he deliberately left Philadelphia on the day of the crime to create an alibi. After receiving Susan's inheritance, they would split the money. Even the police thought this was the case. But the problem was, they didn't have any concrete evidence. So, no matter how reasonable the theory seemed, without evidence, all of this was just a coincidence. The police were well aware of this. So for now, they could only use the $25,000 fraud committed by William as a breakthrough. Breaking the case. In June 1980, the trial for the $25,000 fraud case officially began. However, to everyone's surprise, William completely denied all the charges made by the prosecutor in court. He claimed that he and Susan had no plans to marry, and he didn't know why Susan had told her friends about it. He further stated that they weren't even in a relationship. Moreover, Susan had never given him any $25,000 investment. When asked why Susan left all of her inheritance to him if they were just casual friends, William claimed he knew nothing about it. Not only did he try to distance himself from his relationship with Susan, but he also described her as a troublemaker. He claimed that she often associated with the wrong crowd and visited unsafe places. However, Susan's friends testified one by one, all asserting that William's claims were lies. Unfortunately, these testimonies were all circumstantial evidence, which couldn't really convict him. So, he remained free. But this period of freedom ended on February 20th, 1981. On that day, the police suddenly appeared at William's house and arrested him on charges of fraud. The main reason William was arrested came from the testimony of an important witness, Christopher Pappas, one of William's friends. Pappas testified that he was present when Susan handed the $25,000 to William. William didn't want to deposit the money into a bank, so he asked Pappas to rent a safe deposit box in his name at a bank and store all of the money there. At that time, 3 people had access to the safe deposit box: Pappas, William, and a woman named Wendy Ziegler, one of William's girlfriends. In September 1979, it was Wendy Ziegler who took all the money out of the safe deposit box. After 5 days of trial, William Bradfield was convicted of fraud and began serving his sentence in December 1982. However, he was released on parole after only 2 months in prison. But those 2 short months in prison ultimately led him down a dark path. On April 6, 1983, just a short time after his release, William was arrested again by the police. This time, he was charged with conspiring to murder Susan Reinert and her 2 children. How did the police find out William himself confessed? While serving his sentence for fraud, during a game of chess with a fellow inmate named Noel, William admitted that if Susan hadn't had so much money, she wouldn't have had to die. Moreover, the original plan had only targeted Susan, and the children's involvement was completely unplanned. William had been at the scene when the children were murdered, but he wasn't the one who did it. Faced with the accusations from his cellmate, William firmly denied everything. However, the problem was that his accomplices weren't as resolute as he was. Fearing they would be implicated as the case neared exposure, 2 teachers from his former school, who had helped him create the alibi, turned on him. They testified that William had known that Susan might be in danger. According to the witnesses, at 11:30 p.m. on June 22, 1979, William returned home and called Vincent and Myers, who lived in the same building, to meet him. William told them that Susan Reinert and Jay Smith had a complicated romantic relationship, and that Jay Smith was planning to kill Susan. Fearing he would be implicated, he asked Vincent and Myers to go out of town with him to establish an alibi. Both of them later confirmed this in court, proving that William had known in advance that Susan was in danger. The connection between William and Jay Smith would directly affect the final charge that William would face. Trial. The judge proposed a direct confrontation between Smith, who was serving his sentence in prison, and William. Therefore, in February 1985, after several unsuccessful appeals, William Bradfield was finally sentenced to 3 life terms. Just after William's trial, on June 25th, 1985, exactly 6 years after Susan's murder, Jay Smith, who was still in prison, was brought to court on charges of 3 first-degree murders. This time, the prosecution prepared over 90 witnesses and 110 pieces of evidence. However, all of it was circumstantial. There was no direct evidence. Moreover, Smith's situation was different from William's. He had no clear motive for the crime. Typically, in cases with no motive and no direct evidence, The chances of the jury convicting are low, but Smith was unlucky because of a book. A famous crime writer named Joseph Wambaugh had been following the case for some time and wrote a book about it in 1984, titled Echoes in the Darkness. The book became a bestseller, and in it, the author speculated that J. Smith was the murderer. As a result, whether in public opinion or in the minds of the jury, Smith had already been identified as the killer. On April 30th, 1986, J. Smith was convicted and sentenced to death. But it wasn't the end. In 1989, thanks to Echoes in the Darkness, J. Smith was granted a retrial. It turned out that the author of the book had paid $50 to bribe a detective working on the Susan case and gained access to some exclusive leads. In December 1989, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled to overturn Smith's death sentence. The reason was that the testimonies used to convict Smith were all circumstantial evidence, and the police had intentionally concealed evidence that could have helped the defendant. In September 1992, J. Smith completed his prison sentence and was fully released. Meanwhile, William Bradfield died in prison from a stroke on January 16, 1998. The case of Susan's murder ended there, but clearly, this conclusion was far from complete. To this day, we still don't know who truly killed Susan, and the whereabouts of her 2 children remain unknown. The investigation lasted over a decade and became one of the most expensive cases in the state's history. Indeed, greed made this case so complicated, from the greed for love to the greed for money, leading to the loss of 3 lives. Though the final resolution wasn't entirely satisfying, it did provide some degree of closure for the victim's family.